Hello and welcome to Amoeba Savant. My name is Nalinne Jones and I am reading The Brothers Karamazov. This is chapter 2 in book 2 called The Old Baffoon. Just as they entered the cell, the elder appeared, emerging from his bedroom. Two monks from the Hermitage were already waiting, the Father Librarian and Father Paisi, a sickly man who, although he was not very advanced in years, had a reputation as a great scholar. Besides them, a young man of about 22 wearing ordinary clothes stood waiting in a corner, where he remained standing all the time. He was a divinity student who, for some reason, was a protege of the monks. He was fairly tall, had a fair complexion, prominent cheekbones, and narrow brown eyes that were intelligent and observant. His bearing was deferential, but dignified, without the least subservience. As if conscious of his subordinate and dependent position of not being their equal, he did not greet the visitors. The elder Zosima entered accompanied by a novice and by Alyosha. The monks rose, greeted him with bows so deep that their fingers touched the floor, and went up to him to kiss his hand and receive his blessing. After he had blessed them, Zosima in turn bowed just as deeply, also touching the floor with his fingers, and asked each of them for his blessing. The whole ceremony was performed very seriously, not like some daily rite, but with a real show of feeling. Musov, however, was convinced that it was all put on to impress the visitors. He stood in front of the party deliberating. He had been wondering about it since the day before, whether he should, despite his ideas, just out of courtesy, since it was the custom here, step forward and ask the elder for his blessing, although he certainly would not kiss his hand. Now, seeing all the bowing and hand-kissing of the monks, he made up his mind. Serious and dignified, he went up to the elder, bowed rather deeply by ordinary standards, and moved over to a chair. Mr. Karamazov went through exactly the same motions, but exaggerated them, making them seem ridiculous. Ivan also bowed politely and gravely, his hands stiffly at his sides, while Kalganov was so embarrassed that he didn't bow at all. The elder dropped his hand, which he had raised to bless them, bowed to them once more, and invited them to sit down. Alyosha's worst forebodings were coming true. He was ashamed, and the blood rushed to his cheeks. The elder sat down on a leather-covered mahogany sofa of antique design, while inviting his 4 visitors to sit on 4 mahogany chairs covered with badly worn black leather ranged along the opposite wall. The 2 monks took chairs on either side of the room, one by the window and the other by the door, while the divinity student, Alyosha, and the novice remained standing. The whole cell was rather small and drab-looking. It had only the most indispensable furniture, and even that was poor and crude. There were 2 pots of flowers on the windowsill, and in a corner many icons, one of them a large picture of the Mother of God, probably painted long before the schism. A lamp burned in front of it. Next to it were 2 icons in shiny settings, and beyond them some carved cherubs, little china eggs, an ivory Catholic cross with the Mater Dolorosa with her arms around it, and a few foreign engravings, copies of the great Italian masters of bygone times. Beside these costly, graceful foreign engravings were some rather crude native Russian lithographs of saints and martyrs, the kind that could be bought at any local fair for a few kopecks. On the other walls hung a few portraits of Russian bishops past and present. Musov made a cursory inspection of all this conventional rubbish, then turned to look intently at the elder. He rated his own powers of judgment rather highly, a weakness which was excusable in him since he was already past 50, an age at which an intelligent, cultured man of the world of independent means acquires an exaggerated opinion of his own judgment, sometimes despite himself. He disliked the elder at first glance. Indeed, there was something in Zosima's face that many besides Musov would have disliked. He was a short, stooped little man with very weak legs who, because of ill health, looked at least 10 years older than his 65 years. His very thin face was covered with tiny wrinkles, especially around his eyes. His eyes, small, quick, and shiny, made 2 bright dots in his face. He was bald except for some thin gray hair around the temples. His wedge-shaped beard was very small and scanty, and he had thin thread-like lips, which formed readily into a smile. His nose, although it was not really long, was sharp, like the beak of a small bird. All the signs of a wicked, pettily, supercilious nature flashed through Musov's head. He was still very annoyed with himself. A small, cheap wall clock with weights hurriedly struck 12 times, and this helped to get the conversation started. "Noon on the dot," Mr. Karamazov cried out, "and still no sign of my son Dmitri. I apologize for him, Holy Elder." The, quote, Holy Elder actually made Alyosha shudder. "I, on the other hand," Karamazov went on, "am always punctual. I always arrive exactly on time, knowing that punctuality is the courtesy of kings." "Well, whatever else you may be, you're certainly no king," Musov muttered, unable to contain his irritation. "Yes, that's true. I'm no king, believe it or not, Mr. Musov. I was aware of that myself. I'll even swear to it. I don't know why, but I always say the wrong thing." "Ah, your reverence," he exclaimed with a sudden pathos. "You have before you a buffoon, a true buffoon. That's how I will introduce myself. Alas, it's an old habit with me. And if I sometimes talk nonsense, it is actually intentional to make people laugh, to please them. One must try to please, mustn't one? For instance, about 7 years ago I arrived in a small town where I was trying to set up a little business deal in partnership with some small local businessmen. Of course, we had to see the local ispravnik, police inspector, first to ask a favor of him, you know what I mean, and invite him to dinner. Oh, ispravnik first to ask a favor of him, you know what I mean, and invite him to dinner. So we go there, and the ispravnik appears, and he turns out to be a big, fat fellow with blondish hair and an unsmiling face, the most dangerous type in such cases. It's their livers, you know. You see? Their livers. Well, I turn to him, and the self-assurance of a man of the world, I say, with the self-assurance of the man of the world, I say, "Mr. Ispravnik, we've come to beg you to be our napravnik, if I may say so." "How's that? You're napravnik? What do you mean by that?" Wait. I speak Polish, and some of the words are similar to Russian, and to naprawić is to fix something. But prawo is the law, so it makes sense that a cop is called ispravnik, but I don't know what it really means. I don't speak Russian. "How's that you're napravnik? What do you mean by that?" I could see right away that it hadn't gone over. He just stood there staring at me and looking solemn. "I was just trying to make a pun," I said, trying to cheer up the company a little. "That Mr. Napravnik I was referring to is one of the greatest Russian conductors, and it's a sort of conductor that we need for the harmony of our little enterprise." So I guess that didn't work there, but anyway, interesting. I thought I had given him a reasonable explanation, and the comparison was to the point too, but he just said, "I'm an ispravnik, and I will not tolerate puns with reference to my official capacity." And he started to walk out on us. "Wait," I called out to him. "You're right, absolutely right. You're an ispravnik and not Mr. Napravnik." "No," he says, "you cannot take it back now. I am napravnik." And, of course, our business deal fell through. It's always the same with me. I get myself into trouble by being too friendly. Once, it was many, many years ago, I said to a very important man, "Your wife, sir," I said, "is a very ticklish lady." Meaning in the sense of honor, of moral qualities, you know, and I never expected him to ask me, "What do you know about that? Have you ever tickled her?" Well, I thought it was an opening for some amiable chit-chat, so I said, "Why, yes, sir, I must say I have." Well, the fellow gave me quite a tickling then, too. I can tell it now without shame because it happened so long ago, but in general I always manage to do myself some harm that way. "Like right now, for instance," Musov muttered disgustedly. The elder was looking at the two of them in silence. "You don't say. Well, will you believe me, Mr. Musov, if I tell you I was aware of that too, and, what's more, as soon as I started to speak, I somehow felt that you'd be the first to make some remark? Whenever I realize, your reverence, that my joke isn't succeeding, my cheeks begin to stick to my lower gums like a sort of cramp. It's happened ever since my youth, when I used to be a hanger-on to the local landed gentry, earning my living by being a parasite. I'm a thoroughgoing buffoon, a born buffoon, which is like being one of God's fools, your reverence. I won't deny it, though, that there may be an unholy spirit in me too, but it must be one of minor rank. If it were more important, it would surely have chosen better quarters. But certainly not you, Mr. Musov. You'd offer it pretty shabby quarters. Let me tell you, I at least believe in God. And if I've had some doubts of late, they're gone now as I sit here, expecting to hear words of great wisdom. I, Reverend Father, am like the philosopher Diderot. You may have heard, Holy Father, how Diderot went to see the Metropolitan Platon in the time of the Empress Catherine. He marched in and immediately announced, "There is no God." The Holy Patriarch raised his finger and replied, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." And the last thing, Diderot was lying on his feet and wailing, "I believe, I want to be baptized." And so he was baptized then and there, and Princess Dashkov acted as his godmother and Potemkin as his godfather. This is outrageous. You know very well you're talking nonsense, and that stupid anecdote is quite untrue. Why must you carry on like this? Musov said in a shaking voice, feeling that he was losing control over himself. All my life I've suspected it wasn't true, Karamazov cried excitedly, and now let me tell you the whole truth, gentlemen. Forgive me, O great elder, I made up that last bit about Diderot's being baptized as I was telling the story. It had never even occurred to me till then. I invented it to spice things up a bit. That's why I'm carrying on, Mr. Musov, to be good company, you know, although there are times when I don't really know myself why I do it. As to the Diderot story, I heard the Patriarch's reply to him at least 20 times from the landowners in whose houses I spent my youth, and, by the way, from your Auntie Mavra, among others, Mr. Musov. To this day, they are all convinced that the atheist Diderot went to see the Metropolitan Platon to argue with him about God. Musov was on his feet now. He had not only lost patience, he didn't seem to know what he was doing. He was seething with rage and was conscious that that made him ridiculous too. Indeed, something quite incredible was taking place in the cell. Until then, for 40 or 50 years, the people who had been received there by the elder and his predecessors had come with a feeling of deep reverence. Everyone admitted was conscious of having been granted a great favor. Many knelt the moment they entered and remained kneeling throughout the visit. Even the most learned and prominent people, including freethinkers who came out of curiosity or for some such reason, all felt bound to behave with tact and respect as long as they were in the elder's presence, whether they were received with other visitors or privately. This was especially so because there was no question of money here, but only of love and kindness, on the one hand, and, on the other, penitence, or the longing to solve some spiritual problem or resolve a difficult personal crisis. Consequently, Karamazov's buffoonery, so disrespectful and out of place, surprised and bewildered at least some of the witnesses to the scene. The monks, although their expressions did not change, waited tensely to hear what the elder would say, and seemed ready to leap to their feet like Musov. Alyosha stood with his head bowed, looking as if he were about to burst into tears. He was surprised, too, that his brother Ivan, the only person there on whom he had relied, and the only person in the world who had an influence on his father and could have stopped him, sat motionless in his chair, his eyes lowered, apparently waiting curiously to see how it would all end, as if he himself were a complete outsider and could not possibly be affected. As to the divinity student, Rakitin, whom he knew well, almost intimately, Alyosha didn't even dare look at him, for he knew his thoughts. He was indeed the only man in the monastery to know them. "Please forgive me," Musov said, addressing the elder. "I am afraid you may think that I too have a part in this ridiculous farce. I made a mistake in thinking that even a man like Fyodor Karamazov would understand his obligations when received by a highly respectable person. It never occurred to me that I would have to apologize merely for having come in his company, and..." Musov, too embarrassed to go on, was about to walk out of the room. "Please don't worry," the elder said. He stood up abruptly on his weak legs, took Musov by both hands, and made him sit down again. "Think nothing of it. Believe me, I particularly appreciate having you as my guest," Zosima added, bowing to Musov and returning to his own seat on the sofa. "Oh, great elder, I await your verdict, Am I insulting you with my exuberant behavior or not? Karamazov cried, gripping the arms of his chair with his hands as though he would jump up if he received an unfavorable answer. You too, sir. Please be at ease and rest assured there is nothing to worry about, the elder said in a firm tone. I want you to feel completely at home and, above all, not be ashamed of yourself, for that is what causes all the trouble. Completely at home? My natural self? You mean be my natural self? Oh, that is too kind, much too kind, but I am deeply moved and I accept your invitation. But let me warn you, Blessed Father, do not encourage me to be my natural self. Don't take the chance. Even I wouldn't dare to let myself go entirely. I tell you that for your own good. As for the rest, it is still shrouded in darkness, although there are those who are only too anxious to tell all sorts of stories about me. Yes, I am referring to you, Mr. Musov. As for you, most holy man, allow me only to express my profound admiration. He stood up and, raising his hands toward the ceiling, declaimed, Blessed be thy womb that bore thee, and the paps that gave thee suck. Sorry, particularly the paps. Your remark just now that I mustn't be ashamed because that is what causes all the trouble showed that you could see right through me and decipher all that's going on inside me, just as though through me, just as you said, I do feel ashamed when I meet people that I am the lowest of the low and that they take me for a buffoon. All right, I say to myself, so I'll act like a buffoon. I don't care what they think of me because I really believe that every one of them is even lower than I. Yes, that's why I'm a buffoon. It's out of shame, as you said, great elder. Out of sheer shame. It's a fact that I misbehave this way because I'm oversensitive. If I could only feel that all the people I met considered me a nice, intelligent fellow, I'm sure I'd be the kindest of men. All of a sudden he knelt down, exclaiming, Oh, teacher, what should I do to gain eternal life? It was hard to tell whether he was still fooling or was now really deeply moved. The elder looked at him smilingly and said, You have known for a long time what to do. You are intelligent enough to see for yourself. Stop indulging in drunkenness and incontinence of speech. Do not give way to sensual lust and particularly to your passion for money. Also, close down your taverns. If you cannot close them all, close at least 2 or 3. And above all, stop lying. You mean that story I told about Diderot? No, I didn't really mean that. The important thing is to stop lying to yourself. A man who lies to himself and believes his own lies becomes unable to recognize truth, either in himself or in anyone else, and he ends up losing respect for himself as well as for others. When he has no respect for anyone, he can no longer love, and, in order to divert himself, having no love in him, he yields to his impulses, indulges in the lowest forms of pleasure, and behaves in the end like an animal in satisfying his vices. And it all comes from lying. Lying to others and to yourself. A man who lies to himself, for instance, can take offense whenever he wishes, for there are times when it is rather pleasant to feel wronged. Don't you agree? So a man may know very well that no one has offended him, and may invent an offense, lie just for the beauty of it, or exaggerate what someone said to create a situation, making a mountain out of a molehill. And although he is well aware of it himself, he nevertheless does feel offended because he enjoys doing so, derives great pleasure from it, and so he comes to feel real hostility toward the imaginary offender. But please, get up off your knees and sit down. You know very well that your kneeling is also an insincere gesture, a lie. Blessed man, allow me to kiss your hand, Karamazov exclaimed, leaping to his feet, snatching the elder's wizened hand and hurriedly planting a loud kiss on it. You're right, so very right. It is very pleasant to feel wronged. I've never heard it put so well before. I have, indeed, been taking offense all my life because I enjoyed it and felt it was beautiful. It is not only pleasurable, it is also aesthetically satisfying to feel offended. Yes, that is something you left out, great elder, the beauty of it. I must make note of it. It is a fact that I have lied all my life, every day and every hour. In truth, I am a living lie, the father of lies. No, wait a minute, not the father of lies. I always get my quotations mixed up. Well, let's say the son, and that's good enough. But don't you think, angelic man, one can tell lies like the one about Diderot now and then? Diderot can do no harm, but sometimes a word can cause a lot of trouble. I almost forgot, great elder. For 2 years I've been determined to come here to consult you about something special. But first, perhaps you'd better warn Mr. Musov not to interrupt me. Here's what I want to ask you. Is it true, Holy Father, as it says somewhere in the Lives of the Saints, that one holy miracle worker who suffered martyrdom for his faith stood up after they had beheaded him, picked up his head, kissed it affectionately, and walked for a long time carrying it in his hands and kissing it affectionately? Is that story true? I'm addressing the question to all of you, Reverend Fathers. No, it isn't true, the elder said. There's nothing of the sort in the Lives of the Saints, said the Father Librarian. About which saint is it supposed to be written? I don't know myself, haven't the slightest idea. I was just told the story, misled. And shall I tell you who told me? All right, it was Mr. Musov here, who just now was so furious about Diderot. It was he who told it to me. I never told you anything of the sort. To begin with, I never speak to you at all. Right, you didn't tell it to me, but you did tell it to others in my presence about 3 years ago. I bring it up now because by telling that ridiculous story you undermined my faith. Although you didn't know it, Mr. Musov, I returned home that day with my faith shaken, and it has been getting shakier and shakier ever since. Yes, Mr. Musov, you were the cause of my terrible fall, and that's much worse than my telling the Diderot story. Karamov's tone was brimming with pathos, although it was perfectly clear to everyone that he was acting again. Yet Musov was still stung to the quick. Nonsense, utter nonsense, he muttered angrily. I may have said something of the sort, but I didn't tell it to you, I'm sure of that. I was also told the story. When I was in Paris, a Frenchman told me it was from the Lives of the Saints, and that they read it in Russia in the Mass. He was a very learned man who was making a statistical study of Russia. He had spent a long time in this country. As for me, I've never read the Lives of the Saints, nor do I intend to. Anyway, one says all sorts of things at a dinner party, and it was at one that I told the story. So you ate your dinner, and as a result, I lost my faith that day, Karamazov said, still taunting him. Much I care about your faith, Musov was ready to shout at him, but then, containing himself, he said scornfully, You defile everything you touch. The elder rose abruptly from his sofa. I hope you will excuse me, gentlemen, if I leave you, just for a few minutes, he said, addressing everyone present. Some people who were here even before you arrived are waiting for me. And you, he said, looking cheerfully at Karamazov, see if you can manage without lying. As he started out of the cell, Alyosha and the novice hurried over to help him down the steps. Alyosha, who had been standing holding his breath, was very glad to be out of there, but he was also relieved that the elder didn't seem at all offended and was cheerful as usual. The elder was about to leave the cell to bless those who were waiting for him, but Karamazov stopped him in the doorway. Blessed man, he cried out emotionally, allow me to kiss your hand once more. I see I can talk to you. I can get along with you. Perhaps you think I always lie like this and play the clown? Well, I want you to know that I was deliberately testing you. I wanted to find out if it was possible to get along with you, whether there was room for my humility next to your pride. So let me give you a certificate of good character. It is indeed possible to get along with you. And now I'll remain silent the rest of the time. I'll sit in my chair and I won't say one word. It's your turn to have the floor now, Mr. Musov. You will be the most important person here for the next 10 minutes. And that was the end of chapter 2. It's very funny. I don't know if it's supposed to be funny. I think this is supposed to be a really sad, tragic story, but I find it hilarious. So anyway, let me know what you think in the comments. Is this what you expected it to be like? Sorry if I can't do the voices very well. I'm just doing my best. It's a bunch of dudes talking. And although my voice is quite low, I don't think I'm that great. I wonder if they have Russian accents. They must. It was a Russian book translated, I'm sure. Yep. And anyway, I'm not doing Russians. I'm doing my best, but I can't do Russian accents. That's for sure. So anyway, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video where I read chapter 3 of book 2. Bye.